I am Eleanor Green, and I was, prior to that, known as Eleanor Marie Gallagher, and I grew up in South Boston, Massachusetts in 1922. My birth took place at Kearney Hospital, which was a Catholic hospital, and it was at the top of a hill. And what my family often said to me was that my grandmother had to go back and forth up the hill to visit me, and then after I was home, she would be the one to often take me back up the hill again for examinations and checking on my health. And it was a Catholic hospital run by the Sisters of Charity. And if you have ever seen a picture of the Sisters of Charity, they have voluminous white starched headpieces. And you know, I never thought anything about that as a child. And then when people came to visit me and they saw these nuns, they were very surprised. So, but those early years were memorable in many ways. And even as a child, I was very conscious of the nuns and Catholicism, and the fact that medical care was very inexpensive, extremely so. Well, my mother had other children, and my grandmother's 8 children were all grown up, and so it was possible that my mother had medical issues after my birth, but I don't recall any of that being discussed at any time in my life. Well, my grandparents were very significant in my life, and I was the oldest of 5 children, and 2 brothers and 2 sisters. And I haven't reflected on that part of my life very much, other than recently looking at pictures and seeing where my grandparents lived and where we lived in relationship to them. One thing that does stand out is that a block from my grandparents' home was a very large building, and all of the people who used that building spoke German, because my grandfather was from Germany. And so I, even as a child, would go over to the building for concerts, and the singing was all in German. And the other memory is of being near the ocean, and within easy walking distance of this German hall was the beach where we used to swim. And my parents were both swimmers, and we all swam, and that was a very important part of our life every summer. So those were wonderful memories. You know, I still have an image of myself looking out the window, and I know which bedroom window it was. and looking at the ships coming into the harbor. And it was really the most important memory I have of my childhood. And then when my grandmother wanted me to go with my grandfather on the fishing trips in the harbor and way out before, even beyond when we could see land, that was wonderful. So it's all together, you know, my looking out the window and my grandfather and the fishing trips. They were just beautiful, right? And
Can you smell
and I
the
was
air?
my grandfather's special child too, because of those experiences fishing with him and going to see the Red Sox play. Yeah, we both loved baseball. And yeah, those were special. My grandmother's maiden name was Dolan. She was from an Irish family, and my grandfather's name was pronounced many different ways. I used to say the name as Welfel, Woelfel, but some people called it Wolfel. So anyway, well, the house was a duplex, and it was on a hill, and at the top of the hill was South Boston High School, and beyond the high school there was a monument, and the monument was, you know, I could have looked this up, but I didn't. And the British had been at war earlier in my life, and they were at that hill, and war took place there. Later, South Boston High School was built there, and it is still there. And the monument is still there, and there's a park around the monument. We all had chores depending on our age, mostly dishes, and not much house cleaning. My mother took care of that. The house we lived in was a duplex, side by side, and it was in the middle of this hill going up to the monument. And we had a backyard with a maple tree growing in the yard. And my grandfather not only took care of his property, but he took care of ours. And at various times we had rabbits, and we always had cats, because in the back of our house was a huge field, and there were a lot of animals in that field. And so I never remember a time when we did not have a cat. My parents were both leaders. My father was very active in the American Legion, and often was the leader of a group doing something. And he was on his job, he was in charge of the printing department at the main Boston Public Library, which is a historic building. All of their lives, my both parents were in leadership positions of one kind or another. And so they were a wonderful model for us educationally, for all five of us. No, she never did, other than all these things that she did. She organized women's bridge clubs and was involved in a women's insurance organization. And it wasn't that she had that as a job. It was just a women's insurance organization, and it happened to be a Catholic group. And the main office for the organization was in Erie, Pennsylvania. And my mother, on occasion, because of her leadership in the Boston area, would go to Erie, Pennsylvania for meetings. Well, both my father and my mother's parents came from Ireland, and they were Catholic. And so our family was Catholic, and we went to Catholic schools. And it was just taken for granted. And one of my mother's sisters was a nun, a sister of St. Joseph, and she taught at a Catholic college for women, and it was named Regis College. And yeah, she was quite brilliant. And my Aunt Barbara was my mother's sister. At one point in time was secretary to the governor of Massachusetts. Well, for some reason or other, I used to wake up early in the morning, and for much of my life growing up, I went to Mass every morning. And part of it was I liked to get up early. I liked the walk, the quiet of the morning, and it started my day off meaningfully. And I was the only one of the children, as I remember, who did that. Well, I had gone to the 8th grade and graduated from our parish school. And I think it was mostly my father who decided that I would not go to a Catholic high school or go to South Boston High School. And I was more or less at the top of my class in the 8th grade. And it was his decision that I would go to girls' Latin school. And there was also a boys' Latin school. And so those two schools were part of Boston's history. And at the girls' Latin school, we had a wonderful physical education program. And we played all kinds of sports that, for the most part, were played in college, but we participated at a lower level. And every year, our college put on we were part of a major high school physical education program at the Boston Arena, which still exists. And so for all 4 years I was at Latin school. Every year we would either learn tap dancing or some kind of physical activity, and we would go to the Boston Arena, and there would be all these other high schools, and we would be there representing Girls Latin School. And we also had sports every year. In the fall, we played field hockey. In the winter, we played basketball. And in spring, we played tennis or softball, various sports. We had an extraordinary physical education department at the Latin school, and they probably still do. And the Latin school still exists, and Paula has a catalog or book of the Latin school. I did, because I read Latin in my missal at the Mass, and with a little exercise I would be able to read Latin again. But the Latin is not said in the church anymore. And so, you know, I've sort of lost familiarity because it's not exactly a speech language. Yes, that was the first time I knew someone who was black, and she was only one of 2 black girls in the Latin school at the time I was there. And her name was Doris McKinney, and she went on to the same college I attended, and I was her lifelong friend until her death. Well, my father used to belong to a singing group. My mother's sister, Barbara, was a pianist and organist, and I took piano lessons with her, but music deterred me from physical activities, and it took so much time to practice at the piano. So I gave that up in order to be involved in athletics. Well, the only thing that pops into my mind is that at Latin school we had an opportunity to go horseback riding, and once a week people would come from the stables and pick us up, and for some reason or other my parents thought that would be a good thing for me to do. So I believe that almost for 4 years at Latin school I went riding once a week. And then when I went to college and majored in physical education, every June and September, all of the students would go to Peterborough, New Hampshire, to the college camp, and we had riding there. And the man who was in charge was from Russia, and he had been, I can't remember, but there is a special name for a group of men who rode in Russia. and he belonged to that group. And he asked me if I would help him with some of the riders who were having difficulty. And so I did some teaching of the students who needed help with riding. And he had a daughter whom he used to bring to camp, and he asked me if I would help him take care of his daughter at intervals when he needed a babysitter. And so I became rather close to that family. And sorry, now that I look back, that I lost track of that family, but then I left Massachusetts anyway. I've always been grateful for my family, for the opportunities that they offered their children, and for the support, the lifelong support that they gave me. After Boston University, Sargent College, I took a job at Mercyhurst College in Erie, Pennsylvania. And I was there for 2 years. And I really wasn't being challenged doing what I was doing there. And yet I did learn something of importance, and that was one day, I don't know how it happened, someone must have invited me to go visit a school, and the school was all black, and I realized that the children had a limited education there. And I thought, well, what could you do, Eleanor? And I decided that I would ask the dean at Mercyhurst if I could invite the children to come and use our basketball court, and I would be in charge and teach them games, and for the older children, maybe start them on playing basketball. And I was refused. And that was when I decided to leave Mercyhurst. And anyway, I was thinking of getting a graduate degree, so it was an easy decision to leave. And that was when I decided to go to Fordham University in New York and work on my master's degree, and had an incredible priest there who was my mentor, whom I've never forgotten. He was from Belgium, and anyway, he urged me to go on for my doctorate, and I thought I really didn't have the money at that time and hadn't given it enough thought as to what I would want to do in a doctorate. And so that's when I found out about Xavier University in New Orleans, and wrote and got a job there teaching. And that was an all-black Catholic college. And the woman who was in charge of physical education and needed another faculty member was black and had been a graduate of Xavier and also a graduate of New York University. And for the 2 years we taught together, we had a wonderful friendship. And it was while I was at Xavier that I met Marlon, and then my life changed. Mm-hmm. Well, I think my parents already knew that I was on a different mission, and they never tried to stop me. And I've always been grateful to my parents for their openness with all of their children and their support. They were marvelous parents. Her name is Minnie Finley, and I kept in touch with her for many, many years. And there was a music major at Xavier, and the nun who was in charge of that had sung with the Metropolitan Opera. And she made a decision to teach opera in the music department. And for the years I was there, I did the choreography for the operas. And they were wonderful. She was a magnificent teacher, and there were wonderful voices in the student body. And so that was a highlight of my life there. Well, one of my colleagues at Xavier was Bertha McGrower, and Bertha had worked on her doctorate at Catholic University in Washington, D.C., with a priest whose name was Father Paul Furphy. And he was well published and well known, probably through the whole Catholic community. And he decided that he would put together a group of college students and take them to Europe after the war to see what life was like there after war. And so we took a ship and went first to Belgium, and then we went down the coast by bus to France and to Spain, and then east to Italy. And he had been to Italy before. He had studied there, and so he knew a lot of people and a lot of the special churches, and so we did that with him. And then he made arrangements for us to go to the Pope's summer home at Castel Gandolfo, and we met the Pope there, and the Pope spoke to each one of us individually. It was, right. Yeah, the only picture album I've ever had, and that Paula probably helped me put it together, has those pictures in it. And we came back by ship, and there was a terrible storm, and the ship couldn't cross the ocean. And so the captain decided that he would just travel south near the coast. And we went south to Spain, and by then it was possible to cross the ocean. And so, yeah. And one of the sailors on the ship fell in love with me. And he wanted to come and spend time with me in the United States. And so that was not a possibility. And yeah, I think he wrote to me for a while, but I never responded. So that was that. The city of New Orleans Public Schools decided, I don't know when, whether this was the first year when I was involved, whether that was the first year they had done this, but they decided that they would have a gathering of children from as many public schools as wanted to be involved, and each school learned a dance or something. And yeah, I don't really remember the program, and I don't know if I ever kept a copy of the program. But since there was a segregation every place in the South, to have children from the black schools mingle with children in the white schools was not done. But there was a Catholic seminary there training priests, and they had this huge field. And so Sister Elise, who was the nun putting all this together, got permission to use the field as the place where this demonstration would take place. And so all the schools that wanted learned the same dances, and they were out on this big field, and that was just an immense production and the first of its kind. And I've never thought about that for years and years, but I can still see that field and all those children in their separate schools doing the dances. And so that was a very unusual and very important part of my life, where a lot of change occurred. And it was during that period of time that I met Marlon. And he went off to a Catholic seminary to become a priest, and that did not work out for him. So he joined the Air Force. And we had started to keep in touch and writing back and forth. And eventually the marriage took place in California. Well, I had an aunt who lived there. She was an aunt by marriage, and her husband was dead. And she worked for the Herald Express. I think that was the name of the newspaper in Los Angeles. And she welcomed me, and I lived with her initially until I found my own apartment. And then she had to have surgery, and she asked me if I would take over her job at the Herald Express while she was recuperating. And so Marlon was able to visit a number of times, as I recall, while I was there. And that was when we decided on marriage. Mm-hmm. Well, everything was segregated, even the streetcars and the buses. You had to sit behind a sign which said "for colored." And you could move the sign back and forth depending on who was in the bus. So there were holes on the back of the seat, and you just put the sign in and sat either in front of the sign or in back of the sign. And that was true in both the streetcars and the buses. And you just did it automatically because that's the way life was. I don't know that I ever saw any on the streets or in the buses, because the bus driver would stop the bus if someone didn't move the sign, or they would just stop the bus and go back and have a conversation, and that would be it. No, but one of my colleagues with whom I lived had a car, and so we were able to use her car. Or she would drive us someplace. I mean, there never seemed to be any blockage there. You know, I haven't thought about that in so long that it's very difficult for me to go back and reflect on that. I don't recall any major negative events, and his being in the military made a huge difference. And I don't know if anyone has ever written anything about how the military changed that whole issue of race in this country. I've never even thought about it until we're having this conversation. But probably someone has written about it, but I don't recall anything about that. And part of my lack of information is that we started a family right away, and a family became number one Right, because I haven't reflected on that
My
part of my life. It was so busy. And the decision making around Marlon's leaving the Air Force, all of that was a very, very difficult time. It was almost as if life was nonstop and you just dealt with what was in front of you at the moment and then moved on to the next without reflection. And yes, life was nonstop with one child after another. Joseph, Maria, and Peter, Monica, Paula, and Philip. And I've never had to say that again. I mean, before in my life. And it just blocked me. I think it was very hard, actually. It was, every day was nonstop, and I would fall into bed exhausted. And also dealing with Marlon's issues. And it really was very difficult. Well, my belief in God was no doubt what enabled me to keep going, because I prayed every day, and I knew that everything would be okay. And but it was busy. There was hardly time to think about myself and what I wanted at that particular time, because the work involved with 6 children coming one right after the other, and what was happening in Marlon's life in the military, because he was always the only black officer, and it was very hard for him. And trying to be supportive of him and caring for the children and wondering what is the next step going to be. It was overwhelming, but I managed it. And it was really the grace of God. I think he was pretty fed up with the military, and his only option in terms of a job was to fly. But he also loved flying. And he knew that he was very good at what he did. And he did not, I believe, take into account the difficulties that he was going to face in making that decision. He was hopeful and knew that he was good and that there should be no doubt about his getting a job. And And of course, that was the beginning of a long struggle. A hearing was to be held here in Denver in the courts after he applied. And in the first place, he wondered how he could even get here to Denver for the hearing. And a woman who lived in Aspen had been following in the paper issues of racism, and she was quite wealthy. And when she found that Marlon was coming to Denver for a hearing, she contacted him, and she had a plane that she owned, and she offered it to him. And that's really all I can say about that she was wonderfully supportive, and he had transportation. And so when he came to Denver, he stopped at the cathedral on Colfax for Mass, and there was no altar boy serving the priest, so he went up and served. And the priest invited him to come back to in back of the altar and to chat with him. And he said, "Are you new in this parish?" He probably would have been the only black in the parish. But he said, "Are you new?" And Marlon said, "No, I'm not a member of this parish. I'm here for a hearing." And so the priest said, "Well, tell me more about that." And so Marlon described what he was struggling with. And this priest said, "You need a lawyer, and I know one, and I will send him to you." And I believe on the spot he called the lawyer and told him that Marlon would be coming. And so that was T. Raber Taylor. The Supreme Court made the decision, and the exact length of time I can't give you, but it was close to 7 years, because the case went in and out of court several times. And but Taylor took it all the way to the Supreme Court. And Paula, you were in the court, weren't you? No, the older children were in the court. Yeah, and there was a woman representing New York, and she was wonderful. And between Taylor and this woman, they were extraordinary in presenting the case before the Supreme Court. And then it was hard waiting for the decision. And, you know, as the days went by, it was hard to keep hope up that there would be a positive verdict. And so there was a positive verdict. And he became the first black pilot. But in the meantime, my sister Paula was working for American Airlines. She had been a flight attendant, and after she married, the rule was you couldn't be a flight attendant if you married. So when she married, they gave her a job in the American Airlines office. And so when she heard about Marlon and the talk in American Airlines office in New York, she called. And she thought that it was unlikely that he would ever get a job. And but it turned out that American Airlines hired someone at the time the Supreme Court issued their ruling. So Paula was the one probably that brought the subject up in the office there, because she would have been the kind of person to do that. And so, yeah, it was a huge decision, and it was really hard to feel any exaltation about it, because we were worn out. At least I was worn out. I can speak for myself. It was really hard. I felt more like crying just to get it out of me. Well, that was we were exhausted, number one. And I really have a block about how I was able to keep functioning, because it was a shock. And I don't even remember how we got here. But somehow we did, and we settled down, and Marlon had his first flight. And it was hard for both of us to realize that something we had struggled so hard for had become a reality. There was a numbness about it. For both Marlon and me, I remember that. And it took a while to kind of heal. And it was gradual, so it wasn't as if overnight we were able to say, well, everything's okay now, because it was a day at a time. And yeah, it was very difficult then. Well, I'm sure they did, but I don't recall any of the children verbalizing anything about their attendance at school. That doesn't mean that there weren't slights, but they were so young too, to put that into language, because just going to a new school for anybody is overwhelming. And then to be going to a new school and be different is an added burden. So, I think the fact that when they came home they were loved, and that there were 6 of them, they had one another. And everything changed so gradually. I don't know how to verbalize that. Well, at the point where I knew that I needed to get back into the job market, Paula was looking for a job. And so she gave me the newspaper that she had been looking at, and I looked at it and I saw this description of a job at Metropolitan State College, and I thought immediately, I can do that. And so I applied, and I got an interview, and I got the job. And it was called University Year for Action. And Bob Clifton, who was going to be the director of the program, had he was very political and knew a lot of people who were in politics. And so that's how he got the job as director of this program. And so he interviewed me, and I told him of my background, and I got the job as community coordinator. And my job was to solicit potential students to be involved in this program that he would develop with. He already had guidelines from the Action Agency in Washington. So it wasn't as if he was starting from scratch. And so it was my job then to help with the interviewing of students who were interested in this program, and then to develop courses that they would take to enable them to do their job in the field. And they would be getting paid to do this by Washington. And so I don't know how I did it, but I did it. And it seemed to be one step after another. I was never really overwhelmed by what I was doing. And all of my background in physical education and in working as a camp counselor came to the fore. And so we recruited all these students, and Bob and I together developed the courses that would be part of this program. And he would be, the director. I would be the assistant director, and I would be the one to work with the students in the field. And it came together quite easily because there was so much material from the government that was already to use, and it never seemed difficult. Everything fell into place. And then ultimately, Bob wanted to make some changes, and both he and I started working on our doctorates at the University of Northern Colorado. And then at a point in time, after about a year or a year and a half, I was up in the library at Greeley, and a friend of mine who was also working on her doctorate happened to pick up something that Bob Clifton had written, and she came to me and she said, "Eleanor, Bob has taken something you have written and put it in his name in this book in the library." And so eventually there was a hearing, and at that point they could not retract all of the credit they had given him. So he got a job at CU Denver on the same campus, and I became the director of the program. And so I don't think Bob and I have ever spoken or been in the same place since then. And but he got his doctorate, I got my doctorate, and I was involved in changing the program over the years I was there, and it was very successful, and it still continues. Well, I was, I guess, proud of finishing my doctorate, and but I can't say that's my greatest achievement. I think raising my children is my greatest achievement, not the Supreme Court decision or the Greeley decision, but my children I love. I think I am who I am, and I have great gratitude to God for all the gifts He has given me. Love your neighbor as yourself. I mean, how much can you say beyond that?